darkness. Not the silence of night, but the red-lit haze of fire, the clanging of chains, the endless cavern where souls scream and demons claw. That is the Hades most people imagine. A horned tyrant seated on a throne of bones, laughing at the torment of the damned. In films, he slouches with sarcasm, a trickster draped in blue flames. In comic books, he is the nemesis, the schemer, the devil in a borrowed name. Even in children's cartoons, he becomes a punchline. The underworld turned into a carnival of fear and neon. But this image is not Greek. The Greeks never drew their Hades with horns. They never painted him against a backdrop of fire. They never told stories of him whipping the condemned or roasting sinners in lakes of flame. Those visions belong to a later imagination, born from Christian hells, medieval infernos, and Dante's frozen Satan. The Hades of Homer, Hesiod, and the tragedians is something else entirely. Imagine instead a figure draped in dark red or black robes, a solemn man with flowing hair and a beard, seated not in flame but in shadow. Beside him stands Cerberus, the three-headed hound, not a beast of torture but a sentinel of boundaries, guarding doors, not gnawing souls. In his hand is not a trident like Poseidon, nor thunderbolts like Zeus, but a two-pronged staff, a sign of his rulership. His name is whispered as Plauton, the wealthy one, not because he hoards, but because every gem, every vein of gold, every harvest root grows in the earth he governs. The Greeks respected him. They feared him, yes, but it was not the fear of cruelty. It was the fear of inevitability. For Hades was not the punisher, but the orderer. He did not decide when one died. That was the work of the Moirai, the Fates. He did not chase mortals to torment them. That belonged more to their own choices and to Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. Hades simply received. When the thread of life was cut, when breath left the lungs, he stood waiting at the far side of the river, the silent host who never refused entry. This is where the great misunderstanding begins. To the Greeks, death was not a fiery pit nor paradise of clouds. It was a shadowy continuation, an afterplace that mirrored the world above, but stripped of sunlight. All who died, great and small, traveled down. Achilles, hero of the Iliad, is found lamenting in Hades that he would rather be a farmer's servant alive than a king among shades. Odysseus, in his wanderings, pours blood into the earth so the ghosts may drink and speak to him. The realm of Hades was not torment. It was memory fading, honor lingering, existence without weight. Yet across centuries, as myths traveled, cultures overlapped, and Christianity sought to distinguish heaven from hell. Hades was painted over. The name became fused with punishment, fused with Satan, fused with a cosmic enemy, a god who had once been neither good nor evil, but necessary, was now flattened into a caricature, the devil who laughs in fire. This distortion is not accidental. To early Christian writers, the pagan gods needed to be dethroned, their power undermined. Zeus became a false idol, Apollo a fallen light, and Hades, the one who ruled the dead, was easiest to vilify. What better way to erase a god of balance than to make him the prince of cruelty? But peel back the layers of centuries, and you find the forgotten truth. Hades was not hated among the Greeks. He was dreaded, yes, because death is dreaded, but he was also respected. His temples were few, for mortals hesitated to call him near. Yet sacrifices were always given in black rams, the most solemn offerings whispered at night. His name was invoked in oaths. His presence was woven into law. And his realm, though shadowed, was not chaos. It was order. This is the Hades hidden behind the mask of the devil. A god not of torture but of boundary, not of rebellion but of structure. He was the third brother of the cosmos, equal in birth, different in role. While Zeus hurled lightning and Poseidon churned storms, Hades simply waited. Steady, incorruptible, absolute. And perhaps that is why he unnerves us still. For thunder we can dodge, storms we can outlast. But death waits, unblinking. And in Greek imagination, it wore the face not of a monster, but of a solemn, silent ruler who never lied, never cheated, never yielded. The opening curtain of our story, then, is not fire but shadow, not chaos but stillness. Hades, the forgotten truth of the god of the underworld, sits before us, not as devil, not as tormentor, but as the inescapable balance of all things. And so the story begins, not in flame, but in silence. He was born into a world where love was devoured before it could breathe. Cronus, king of the Titans, had been warned that one of his children would one day overthrow him. And so, each time Rhea gave birth, Cronus swallowed the infant whole. One after another, new life disappeared into his hunger. Hestia was taken first, then Demeter, then Hera. Poseidon followed. And then came Hades, the quiet child, swallowed before he could cry. He did not see light, nor hear lullabies, nor feel the warmth of his mother's embrace. He entered existence through darkness and remained in it. Inside his father's belly, Hades lingered with his siblings in a prison of silence. No sun, no stars, only the muffled echo of time passing in fear. It is easy to imagine how such beginnings shaped him. If Zeus, the last-born who escaped swallowing, became bold and thundering, Hades became the opposite, inward, restrained, patient. He had no space for rashness. His earliest experience was waiting, enduring silence until deliverance arrived. That deliverance came through the youngest brother, Zeus. With cunning and aid from their mother, Zeus tricked Cronus into drinking a potion that forced him to vomit up the swallowed children. Out came the gods, one after another, grown but marked forever by their imprisonment. Among them was Hades, stepping into light for the first time. Imagine that moment. After a lifetime in darkness, sight strikes the eyes, color bursts into the mind. The world is too wide, too sharp, too overwhelming. Where Zeus rushed forward with hunger for conquest, Hades stood still, measuring it all. His silence was not weakness. It was the caution of someone who had known what it meant to be trapped. As the children of Cronus rallied to overthrow the Titans, each found their nature. Zeus, the voice of command. Poseidon, the restless force of seas. Hades, the shadow in their ranks, quiet but unyielding. The scars of their father's fear lingered in all of them. But for Hades, the mark was deepest. He had lived entirely in captivity. Freedom was not to be squandered. It was to be protected by law, order, boundary. This is why, later, when poets described him as stern and unbending, it was not cruelty. It was the hardness of one who had survived darkness and could not allow chaos to return. Where Zeus thundered with passion, Hades built walls. Where Poseidon stirred storms, Hades set rules. The child who had been swallowed never forgot the taste of disorder. And so he became the god who demanded stability above all. His siblings would later embody abundance, marriage, harvest, sea, sky. But Hades embodied memory, the awareness that all things are temporary, that even gods are born from fear and swallowed by time. In his youth, he was not yet king of shadows. He was simply the quiet brother, a survivor of darkness, stepping into a war that would soon demand his silence be sharpened into something greater. Strategy. The Titanomachy was coming, the clash of gods and titans, and the child of darkness was about to find his purpose. The mountain shook like a drum. Olympus flared white with lightning. Orpheus answered with a wall of shadow. Between them, the air smelled of iron and rain, and the ground fractured into ragged mouths. The young gods stood shoulder to shoulder, new light against old stone. The Titans, vast and seasoned, locked shields in a ridge of bronze, their silhouettes jagged against a bruised sky. Zeus raised his arm. Thunder leapt. The sky tore open and stitched itself shut again with light. Poseidon struck his trident into the earth, and valleys remembered the sea. The soil heaved, plates slid, rivers changed their minds. But the sound that decided the war was not thunder or surf. It was the sound of nothing, the hush that followed when Hades put on the helmet. The Cyclopes had forged it in the deep, after they were freed from Tartarus, after dust and gratitude still clung to their hands. 3 gifts for 3 brothers, thunderbolts for Zeus, the trident for Poseidon, and for Hades the helm of darkness. A crown that swallowed presence, erased the sheen of a body, thinned a god to a thought. No clatter of armor, no weight on gravel, no breath. When he drew it over his brow, the world forgot him. Strategy begins where noise ends. Hades stepped sideways into the heat of battle and became a temperature drop. He slid past fallen spears and the long shadows of the Titans' greaves. He drifted under banners stitched by centuries, past the bronze knees of Hyperion, past Cronus's pale grasp, searching the air for an enemy that wouldn't exist until it touched him. Zeus needed the open sky to strike. Poseidon needed water or earth to answer him. Hades needed only the space between a heartbeat and the next. He moved first for the hinges. War is doors as much as men, the places that swing and the hands that hold them. He found the Titans' supply of stones for their slingers, stacked in a crescent gray as a winter moon. The sling masters reached and found emptiness. He touched the axles of chariots. Pins loosened, wheels argued, and the ground gathered its tacks. He stood behind standard bearers and breathed a thought into their ears. Nothing like speech, more like a memory of winter. And the banners dipped without orders, an army's spine bending by a single vertebra. Atlas, broad as a cliff, hurled boulders that painted parabolas across the day. They broke mountainsides like loaves of bread. Hades watched the rhythm, counted the pauses between lift and throw, and stepped to the place where the next boulder would begin its fall. He didn't push, he rearranged an outcome. The stone kissed the ground, too near its sender. Atlas staggered. A gap opened in the Titan's line. Zeus saw it, lightning already in his hand, and turned it into noon. Hades kept no tally. He adjusted. He unmade advantages. He opened small doors, and through those doors, his brother sent storms. Cronus, cutting the air with a curved blade that had once ended his father's sky, strode the ridge of Orpheus like a verdict. At his side marched Iapetus, old scars bright as fresh rules. Cronus knew fear as a tutor and suspicion as a craft. He sniffed the wind the way hunters sniff for snow. Something missing. Something present by its absence. He commanded the Furies? No. Those answered a different law, not his. He called for vigilance and heard his own voice vanish into the clamor. He gripped the sickle tighter. The air grew colder by a whisper. Hades stood a breath behind him. There are blows one can see and block. There are blows one can hear and brace for. And there are the hands of consequences, which arrive without sound, without light, without theater. Hades did not stab or strike. He touched Cronus's shadow with his staff and tilted it a finger's breadth to the left. When the next bolt came from Zeus, it found not the king's chest, but the ground at his feet. The earth leapt, and the old tyrant stumbled, not felled, not humiliated, simply corrected, like a column nudged toward its crack. Poseidon felt the opening and drove his trident into the fractures. Faults split. The Titans' rear ranks fought the terrain as much as gods. Titanomachy, the 100-handed, roaring with the joy of usefulness after long storage in darkness, let fly a storm of rocks that remembered, in their falling, how to be meteors. Still, the war did not break. Old powers die hard. Hyperion's light kept returning. Cronus's cunning receded formations. Iapetus's spear wrote long arguments in the air. Hades moved among them as a revision. He cooled the light, not by extinguishing it, but by thickening the air around it. He left Cronus's careful lines intact, but lifted the pegs of their tents, so that when they needed rest, the wind had other plans. He did not shatter Iapetus's spear. He made sure the leather thong snapped at the moment of draw, so strength met surprise and lost surety. On the seventh long day, when even myths begin to feel the ache of time, Zeus gathered the younger gods, voice roughened by lightning, eyes bright and tired. "One more strike," he said, "one more deliberate tilt." The plan was not a roar, but a whisper. Build a storm so loud that the enemy forgets to listen for footsteps. Hades nodded once. He had already vanished. He crossed the threshold into the Titans' heart camp, where the ground was smoother from many returns, where commanders grew careless with their maps. He stood beside the table of stones that marked hills and rivers, and wherever he set a fingertip, the stones cooled. When hands returned to move them, they recoiled at the unexpected chill, and the map's owners revised their confidence without knowing why. He found the chords of a war drum and loosened them a quarter turn. Its next call sounded like doubt. Cronus entered, blade at his hip. The room tasted of iron, and the old dream of never being surprised again. Hades circled him once, the way absence circles a thought. Then, in that pause before a leader speaks, when 1,000 outcomes court a single word, Hades leaned near enough that only fate could have heard, and placed a weightless thing in the room. The idea that this could end. Cronus spoke. It was strong, but human. Outside, the sky answered by being sky. Zeus threw daylight until the shadows had to choose their shapes. Poseidon bent the ground as if it were water and turned Orpheus' slope into an argument that slid downhill. The Titans fought. They did not flee, but they yielded space, and space is how wars keep score. When the brothers finally closed, it was not a leap, but a tightening. The Titanomachy pinned. The Cyclopes cried out with the strange happiness of makers watching their tools do what they were made to do. Zeus struck, and the last bolt did not destroy. It named an ending. The Titans fell, not as villains spitted on the stage, but as eras concluding. Hades removed the helmet. He existed again. The world remembered him in a shiver. No cheer rose for him. Stealth does not collect applause. He looked over the field the way a judge looks over a ledger, sober, exact. There would be bindings now, and gates and a watch that would need to hold for as long as memory lasts. He did not love it. He did not hate it. He recognized it. Strategy had not been a matter of glory for him. It had been the art of preventing chaos from getting a second wind. The child who had survived darkness had learned to use it, not as a weapon of terror, but as a tool of balance. He had placed advantages in the right hands at the right seconds and left no signature but the outcome. The war was over. The consequences were beginning. If this hidden portrait of Hades is reshaping what you thought you knew, take a moment to subscribe and like. There's more to unmask: quiet gods, mistaken villains, and the patterns that keep a world from tearing itself apart. Back to the story. When the dust settled and the groans of bent mountains quieted, the brothers stood together, not as thunder, water, and shadow, but as a new order. They would draw lots, not to reward themselves, but to divide responsibilities. So the sky would be answerable, the seas would be answerable, and the dead, who outnumber the living in every era, would be answerable. Hades looked toward the earth's deep places and understood the task that was about to have his name. After the shouting of mountains came a quieter noise, the murmur of agreements. Smoke drifted in dull ribbons, and the air held the ache of spent thunder. Where armies had stood, only tracks remained. The new gods gathered, not as victors gorging on triumph, but as architects facing a blueprint the size of the world. Someone had to decide who held which door. They did not argue long. They did not draw swords. Order had to begin with an act that could not be accused of favoritism. So they chose the oldest instrument of fairness: chance. They would cast lots. The terms were simple, the weight behind them immeasurable. A helmet became the bowl. Pebbles were marked. A hush went over the assembly, the kind that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with consequence. The Moirai needed no invitation. Where destiny is weighed, they always arrive. Cloth whispered. Eyes studied the ground so they would not be tempted to claim that looking had influenced fate. Zeus drew first. The sky. It fit his stride, his voice, his appetite for horizons. The air brightened around him, as if pleased to have a name. Poseidon drew next. The sea. A low sound rolled through the earth like a memory of waves, and the seabirds somewhere far off seemed to answer a call they didn't know had been made. Hades drew last. The Underworld. No one gasped. No one flinched. The gods were not children. They understood that the drawing was not a sentence. It was an assignment. The earth itself, the broad middle, would belong to all. Olympus would be shared. But the deep place, the kept place, the counting house of endings, would bear his seal. This was not punishment. This was symmetry. Sky above, sea around, depth below. A world that breathes needs lungs, but it also needs gravity. Hades became gravity. He did not protest. He did not bargain for a trade or ask for clarifications. He bowed, a small motion that felt like a hinge finding its groove. In that single tilt of the head, you could read an entire biography. Swallowed once, freed once, and now entrusted with the one realm that never runs out of citizens. What does it mean to rule the underworld? Not to chase the living, not to speed the dying, not to relish sorrow. It means to keep the ledger. It means to build gates that swing only one way unless law itself grants permission. It means to accept that you will host everyone, kings and shepherds alike, and treat their shades as equally weightless. The Moirai dipped their heads, as if a mechanism had seated itself correctly. Oaths were spoken. The Styx, black, binding, was named as witness. Among the gods, there is no oath more serious than one sworn by that river. Perjury there cracks a deity's strength for years. Hades accepted this gladly. He preferred laws that could not be mocked. Zeus looked upward, already composing a language of thunder and hospitality. all those rituals that would keep men from fear when the sky spoke. Poseidon held the trident as if it were both instrument and promise. He would learn the moods of brine, the tight geometry of harbors. Hades, for his part, studied the ground, not the surface, the undertext. He watched a beetle vanish into soil. He noticed how roots chose their roads without asking permission. Down there was a script older than temples. He would read it well. There is a common misunderstanding that Hades was sent down, as if exiled. Exile implies disgrace. But the new rule of the cosmos had no room for disgrace. It had room for balance. The brothers were equals, differentiated by domain, co-sovereigns of a single system. When poets later sang of quarrels, they were quarrels of family, not hierarchy. Earth and Olympus remained common ground. The gods would meet, feast, argue, and decide. Mortals would pray up the mountain and out to the horizon. But when the last breath left a body, when silence replaced hunger, the path would slope toward Hades. Not because he demanded it, but because paths slope toward the honest end of things. The very name shifted as if trying on a new coat. Hades, yes, the unseen, but also Pluton, the wealthy. Not wealth as hoard, but wealth as hidden abundance. Metals, seeds, the patience of orchards, the long accumulation of what grows in darkness until time says now. Farmers would understand this instinctively. They bury hope and wait. The underworld is where waiting learns to be a craft. What kind of king rules such a place? One who does not shout, one who does not court applause, one who measures twice and cuts once and then keeps the knife clean. The poets would remember him as stern. They did not mean cruel. They meant the sort of steadiness that makes other people stop fidgeting. Zeus would have his festivals, his traveling hymns, his thunder as punctuation. Poseidon would have salt and storm, shipwreck and rescue, the spine-tingling relief of a harbor light after months of gray. Hades would have quiet acknowledgments, a black ram given at night, a name spoken sideways because the living prefer not to summon attention from the place where attention ends. Few temples would rise, not because he was hated, but because gratitude prefers light and petition prefers hope. To approach Hades is to admit that something is finished. The living are frugal with that admission. He did not take offense. He did not need crowds. He needed corridors that work. With Charon, he would keep the river crossing exact. No coin, no passage. No body buried, no ferry. With the judges, he would make sure that choices had shape even after heartbeat, that excellence didn't evaporate and wickedness didn't swagger unchallenged. With the Furies, he would grant the world the dignity of consequences. With Thanatos and Hypnos, he would coordinate timing and rest. This was governance at its most unromantic and most necessary. From Olympus, the view was spectacle. From the sea, drama. From below, logistics. Hades embraced the unglamorous truth that worlds survive not on stories alone, but on systems. The underworld would be a system. Gates, keys, records, seasons. Eventually a queen who travels, and with her, a calendar of grief and return that teaches the surface how to breathe. Even in this early moment, the outlines of that later story flickered. Fields that go barren and bloom. A mother who learns that loss can be cyclical, not absolute. Fate loves patterns. Hades would not fake tenderness, but he would allow it to exist beside necessity. The brothers sealed their agreement with gestures that became customs. Zeus raised a cup to the open air. Winds carried the toast. Poseidon set the trident's tines into a pool. Circles spread as if the sea were nodding back. Hades laid his palm on the earth and felt it answer with a deep, toneless note that only he seemed to hear. There was no coronation parade for him, no choirs. Instead, he descended the first of many stairways, some carved, some natural, all of them smelling of mineral and old water. Torches stitched small oranges into the dark. Cerberus was not yet at his heels. That companion would come later. For now the hallways were unguarded, the realm more concept than palace. He moved through chambers with no furniture, past rivers without names, as if touring a building still waiting for its occupants. What does a ruler do in an empty kingdom? He writes the rules careful enough that when the rooms fill, the furniture will know where to stand. He chooses which doors can open both ways and which must stay shut. He decides that mercy is not a river, but a bridge, and bridges need engineers. On the surface, mortals began again, plowing, marrying, breaking treaties, building songs. In the sky, Zeus learned that power is part spectacle, part patience. On the waves, Poseidon discovered that rage is a tide and must be managed like one. Below, Hades set the bones of a law that would outlive empires. Nothing is lost, everything is accounted for. The cosmos, newly parceled, felt less like a battleground and more like a machine that had found all its screws. Above, a hawk cut an arc so clean it looked premeditated. Below, a seed split, decided on a direction and trusted the dark. The world had 3 keepers now. None was an enemy to the others. Each was a boundary. And in the deepest boundary, where silence does the talking, a quiet king began the work that history forgets and memory depends on. The banquet halls of Olympus shimmered with gold, laughter, and music that rolled like waves against marble walls. Gods toasted victories, flirted across tables, plotted alliances over cups of nectar. Zeus sat at the center, lightning still smoldering in his eyes, his voice booming louder than the chorus. Poseidon's booming laughter joined, echoing like surf against cliffs. Cups clinked, dancers spun, torches flared. And at the far edge of the hall, almost a shadow among the glitter, sat Hades. He was there, yet apart. Not unwelcome, not despised, but quiet. His posture different from his brothers, his eyes steady rather than restless. Where Zeus measured every person as potential ally or conquest, and Poseidon as rival or partner in jest, Hades simply regarded. He did not chase glances across the table. He did not rise to tell stories of his thunder or his tides. He listened. He remembered. And when he spoke, the room hushed, for his words came rarely and landed with the weight of law. The contrast was stark. Zeus could not resist temptation. Goddesses, nymphs, mortals, all caught in the net of his desire. Poseidon was no different, his heart as storm-tossed as his seas. The myths are crowded with their adventures and betrayals, children scattered like seeds in the wind. But Hades, no trail of seductions, no court of broken promises. His devotion would center on one woman only, Persephone. And when she became his queen, he would never stray. The Greeks noticed this difference. They may have feared his realm, but they also respected the steadiness of his character. If Zeus embodied passion and Poseidon embodied mood, then Hades embodied constancy. He did not rush. He did not scheme for thrones that were not his. He did not thunder when silence was better. He kept to his domain and ruled it thoroughly. This distance made him a stranger, even to his family. Zeus and Poseidon quarreled often, over cities, over honors, over pride. But at least they quarreled in sight of one another. Hades seldom quarreled at all. When disputes rose on Olympus, he seldom left the underworld to join them. His absence was its own statement. The surface world belonged to the restless. He had weightier things below. And yet, despite his reserve, he was not cold. Poets did not write of him as cruel or bloodthirsty. They wrote of him as stern, a king whose fairness was harder to bend than any stone. He was the brother who never broke his word, the judge who did not play favorites. To mortals, that was terrifying, because what they wanted most was mercy. To the gods, it was invaluable, because what they needed most was order. In many myths, Hades is silent. He appears at the edge of stories, steps in only when boundaries are tested. When a hero seeks to cheat death, when a mortal tries to steal from the land of shadows, when gods interfere too freely in what belongs to the dead, then Hades acts. Otherwise, he waits. That waiting became his most defining quality. Silence can be misread. Later ages mistook his distance for malice, his restraint for cruelty. But in the oldest songs, his silence was simply the quiet of inevitability. Death does not rant. Death does not chase. It waits. And when the time comes, it keeps its promise. The Greeks recognized the brothers as a trinity of contrasts. Zeus commanded the air with sudden violence. Poseidon churned seas and quaked earth in unpredictable moods. Hades maintained the one truth neither storm nor thunder could erase. All lives end. That truth, carried with dignity, made him the most solemn of them all. His siblings bore the marks of their freedom differently. Zeus grew bold, Poseidon restless. But the child who had lived longest in darkness became the adult who carried it inside him. He did not flaunt his power, because power for him was not spectacle, it was certainty. And so, in the myths, when he finally chose his queen, it was not with the fire of lust or the whim of a passing mood. It was with the gravity of a decision that once made would never be undone. He would love Persephone with the same silence that had shaped him. And in that silence, he would become not only the god of endings, but of devotion. The gods above would always struggle with impulse. Hades would always struggle with solitude. But in that solitude, he found his strength. The strength of the brother who did not need applause to know his place in the world. The realm of Hades was not a solitary throne. It was a network of thresholds, each guarded by figures who themselves lived on the edge of existence. If Olympus was a chorus of light and music, the underworld was a council of boundaries. Hades did not rule alone. He ruled with keepers whose very natures embodied transitions. Life to death, sleep to waking, crime to punishment, mortal fear to immortal law. At the river's edge stood Charon, the ferryman. His boat was narrow, his back bent, his hands calloused from endless oars. He did not decide who entered. He only carried those who had the coin to pay. To the Greeks, he was less a villain than a bureaucracy incarnate. No coin placed under the tongue? No crossing. Hades entrusted him with the first line of order. The dead must be recognized as dead, and rituals must be kept. Beside him worked Thanatos, death itself, not as reaper with scythe, but as quiet hand. Thanatos was not cruel. He was inevitable. In vase paintings, he appears as a winged figure, gentle almost, carrying the lifeless as if cradling them. His twin was Hypnos, sleep, who gave mortals a nightly rehearsal for the long rest to come. Brothers of boundary, one temporary, one permanent. Both served Hades by reminding the living that existence is fragile and passage is constant. In the halls of judgment roamed the Furies, Alecto, Tisiphone, Megaera. They were not demons of chaos, but of balance, punishing oath-breakers, haunting murderers who thought themselves beyond consequence. Where Zeus hurled thunderbolts against those who defied him openly, Hades let the Furies stalk silently, ensuring that crime, however hidden, was never free of echo. They were vengeance, yes, but vengeance braided tightly with justice. At the borders of dream and shadow flickered Hecate. Torch in hand, goddess of crossroads, witchcraft, and liminal places. She was honored not just in the underworld, but at thresholds of houses, gates of cities, places where choices split like rivers. Hades kept her close, for his kingdom was nothing if not the greatest crossroad of all. In some myths, she was Persephone's companion. In others, she was his ally, her torches lighting the halls no mortal eyes could map. And then there was the hound, Cerberus. 3 heads, 1 body, each head watching a different approach. Not a beast of torment, but a sentinel. His purpose was simple. No living soul enters uninvited, no dead soul escapes. Greek poets described him as terrible, but not evil. An animal loyal to its master, chained not for cruelty but for containment. Heroes who tried to pass him had to meet the boundary head-on. Orpheus lulled him with music, Heracles grappled him with bare hands. But in every telling, Cerberus was not the villain. He was the lock on the door. Together, these figures formed the architecture of the underworld. Each embodied a border, and each reminded mortals that the world of Hades was not fire and chaos, but structure. You crossed only with the right coin. You were taken only when your time was cut. You slept and died by laws as old as the soil. You were judged, punished, or rewarded not by whim, but by rule. Hades himself did not chase criminals across the earth, nor tempt mortals to sin, nor gleefully seize souls. He did not need to. His keepers stood at every gate. His companions embodied every transition. He was the king not of cruelty, but of inevitability. The living may have feared his silence, but they trusted his borders. And in this council of thresholds, you can see the mind of Hades reflected. He had no use for glamour, for armies of flattery, for feasts of vanity. He surrounded himself with figures who understood the edges of existence, because he himself had always been an edge. Swallowed, freed, assigned, waiting. A god shaped by thresholds chose guardians who lived as thresholds. Thus, the underworld became not a dungeon, but a machine of balance, where every door had its keeper, and every keeper knew that silence is as important as thunder. Close your eyes and imagine how most today would draw Hades. Horns curling like rams, a crown of fire, skin ember red, standing over a pit of torment. That image comes not from Greece, but from Dante, medieval woodcuts, and cartoons. Greek eyes saw him differently. On black figure vases, he is a dignified man, bearded in dark robes, seated like a magistrate. No horns, no flames. In his hand a staff, often a 2-tined bident, and beside him a 3-headed dog. The scene is quiet, not chaotic. Authority through presence, not spectacle. On red figure craters he bears another name, Pluton, the wealthy one. In his arm, a cornucopia spills grain, fruit, and coins. Wealth here is not greed, but the truth that the earth below holds seeds, gems, and roots, all hidden riches. Another epithet, Polydegmon, receiver of many. It does not mock the dead, it simply counts. Kings and farmers, poets and warriors. He receives them equally when the Moirai cut the thread. Sometimes, artists place a key in his hand, long, ceremonial. It does not unlock treasure, but thresholds. Life into death, doors that open only once. A reminder that his role is not punishment, but guardianship. Notice what is absent. No bat wings, no goat legs, no pitchfork for torture. The later pitchfork devil grew out of Poseidon's trident, confused with a farm tool. Hades' bident is not a weapon, but a symbol of jurisdiction. Beside him sits Persephone, not a captive in chains, but enthroned as queen, veiled, serene, holding a pomegranate as seal of rule. Ancient artists showed her as partner, not prize. The underworld here is a court with order, not a dungeon of chaos. Other figures appear in the same frames. Hermes Psychopompos, hat on head, leading shades by the wrist. Hecate, torch alight at the crossroad. Demeter searching with her torches. Orpheus with a lyre. Or Heracles gripping Cerberus's leash while Hades watches calmly, permitting the task under strict terms. The palette itself is telling. No inferno red. Instead, terracotta, black, white, and ochre. The colors of law, soil, and stone. Even depictions of Tartarus show punishments for the guilty. But Hades remains distant, unflinching, impartial. Coins echo this. In some cities, Pluton's face appears beside Persephone's. In others, only symbols: torch, grain, flower of descent. States chose what to stamp on their money to show what they revered. They stamped not torment, but plenty. In Eleusis, initiates of the mystery cult learned secrets of death and return. There, Hades as Pluton stood with Demeter and Persephone in a trinity of fertility, loss, and rebirth. He was not the destroyer of harvests, but their hidden partner. Playwrights rarely made him antagonist. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides wrote tragedies where Hades was condition, not villain. Trouble arose from hubris, oaths broken, or mortals who resisted law. His realm was the background of justice, not its enemy. Even in speech, Greeks approached him with care. They avoided his name, using euphemisms: the unseen, the wealthy one, good counselor. This was not fear of cruelty, but reverence for inevitability. When Rome inherited the myths, they called him Dis Pater, the rich father, and Orcus, the god of oaths. Later centuries stitched these names to the fire-stained devil, but the older cloth carried weight, not flame. It was the Middle Ages that redrew him. Woodcuts needed a villain for sermons. Horns, fire, tridents, hooves. The imagery spread faster than correction. Modern films and games echo this distortion. The caricature repeated until it became mistaken for origin. But in museums, the pottery still whispers. A throne, a staff, a queen with a pomegranate, a dog who guards the gate, a key to a door that only opens once. That is Hades, not a carnival of torment, but a magistrate of necessity. Images matter. Misdraw Hades as a devil, and every story about him tilts toward crime. See him as a ruler robed in silence, and the myths return to their original tone. Persephone's descent as treaty, Orpheus's failure as broken condition, Sisyphus's punishment as symbol, Heracles' trial as negotiation of terms. So when we say Hades has been misdrawn, we mean more than the horns are wrong. We mean the emotional key is misplaced. He is not fire but stone, not sadist but judge, not demon but structure. The correction is not trivia. It restores the atmosphere in which the next stories belong. When he loves, it is with permanence. When he judges, it is with procedure. When he appears, it is not to terrorize, but to remind. The vase remains still in its glass case, colors dimmed but lines sharp. Hades sits, calm, bearded, dignified. Persephone at his side. A dog who watches, a staff that points, not strikes. Centuries of misdrawn horns fall away. The real figure reemerges. Hades, the magistrate of endings. The Olympians were known for their passions. Zeus thundered with desire, storming into affairs that toppled kingdoms. Poseidon raged like the seas, quick to flood cities when insulted, quick to sire offspring with mortals. Even gentle Apollo could turn cruel when mocked, and Artemis, when slighted, unleashed arrows without mercy. The gods were vast, volatile, boundless in appetite. But Hades was different. In the myths, he rarely appeared above ground. His name was invoked with caution, but not his presence. Unlike his brothers, he did not disguise himself in animal form to seduce maidens, nor chase after fleeting infatuations. His heart was not restless, but steady. Once he chose Persephone, he chose once and forever. No rivals, no straying, no scattered children to complicate the genealogies of myth. His restraint was not weakness, it was discipline. Greek poets described him as stern, but what they meant was measured. He did not erupt in fits of vanity or jealousy. He ruled with silence, his judgments falling not as thunderclaps, but as finalities. For him, love was not pursuit, it was covenant. Justice was not revenge, it was balance. Authority was not display, it was function. This separation made him unsettling to mortals. A god who did not laugh, did not rage, did not lust. How could he be understood? To the Greeks, unpredictability was almost comforting. It meant one might bargain, flatter, or bribe. Hades, however, did not bend. No sacrifices could alter the fact that all mortals must eventually pass into his halls. No temple flattery could make him look away. And yet, this very restraint gave him dignity. Unlike Zeus, who often stumbled in the chaos of his own passions, Hades kept his realm unbroken. Unlike Poseidon, who lashed out and regretted, Hades maintained his composure. He was the god who would not humiliate himself by excess. This explains why he was feared, but also why he was respected. For mortals, fear came from knowing he could not be manipulated. For gods, respect came from knowing he could be trusted. In councils on Olympus, if Hades spoke, his words carried weight, not because of volume, but because they were rare and deliberate. A single sentence from him could silence a hall. His restraint extended to mortals' fates. He did not drag the living prematurely into death. He did not haunt them with disease or strike them with curses. Those tasks belonged to other deities, other forces. Hades simply accepted what arrived. He was impartial. Heroes, cowards, kings, beggars. Once they crossed the river, they belonged equally to him. Even his punishments for cheaters of death reflect restraint. Sisyphus, condemned to roll his stone, was not torn apart, not burned, not mutilated. His torment was symbolic, futility itself, an idea turned into eternity. Tantalus, forever thirsty beside unreachable water, was not mutilated, but reminded endlessly of what he once abused. These punishments show not sadism, but a quiet artistry. The crime mirrored in the penalty, the law reflected back on the offender. This quality also explains why his love stories, rare as they are tinged with subtlety. When Minthe, a nymph, caught his attention, Persephone transformed her into mint, leaving only fragrance behind. When Lus, another nymph, drew his gaze, Hades later transformed her into a white poplar in memory. These were not wild betrayals or jealous quarrels. They were small ripples, quickly absorbed into myth. Even in affection, he did not leave chaos behind, only quiet symbols that endured. For all his silence, he was not a cold machine. He had depth of feeling, but feelings expressed without spectacle. Where Zeus flaunted desire and Poseidon brandished rage, Hades cloaked his emotions in stillness. He was the god whose love turned into trees, whose compassion granted Orpheus a chance, whose patience allowed heroes to attempt the impossible. He did not abolish sorrow, but he gave it structure. That restraint makes him, paradoxically, the most human of the gods. For who among mortals does not know the weight of holding back, the ache of duty over impulse, the silence of enduring rather than exploding? In Hades, mortals saw not a distant tyrant, but a mirror of the hardest parts of themselves. So when myths painted him as stern, it was not condemnation. It was respect for the god who could have thundered, could have lusted, could have burned with envy, but did not. He chose silence, boundaries, and constancy. He chose restraint, and in that restraint, he became indispensable. It begins with a meadow, the kind of place mortals dream of when they imagine spring. Soft grass, blossoms trembling with bees, a sky so gentle it feels painted. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, walked there with her companions, gathering flowers. The air itself seemed to lean toward her, for she was the child of harvest, the maiden of bloom, the promise of cycles yet to ripen. She reached for a narcissus, its petals unusually bright, its scent heavy enough to bend the air. At that moment, the ground shifted. Soil cracked like a door pulled from its hinges, and from beneath surged Hades in his golden chariot. Black horses thundered. Before the cries of her companions had finished echoing, Persephone was swept away, the earth closing over them like a scar. To later storytellers, this was the image of abduction, of a god who seized what he wanted. But the older tellings are more complex, more shaded with law than lust. Zeus had already consented. The division of realms meant each brother must rule not only land, but lineage, and Persephone's joining to Hades would bind heaven, earth, and underworld into a single cycle. This was no random crime. It was treaty cloaked in drama. Still, to Demeter, it was loss beyond measure. The mother of harvest wandered the earth with torches, searching every field, every cave, her grief withering crops as she went. Famine spread, mortals starved. The gods themselves trembled, for a worship requires life, and life was flickering. Zeus relented. A compromise was struck. Persephone would dwell part of the year with Hades as queen of the underworld, and part with Demeter as daughter of the earth. Here enters the pomegranate. Before Persephone returned, Hades offered her the seeds. To eat in the underworld was to bind oneself to it, to acknowledge its law. She tasted 6 seeds, 6 months. Half the year beneath, half the year above. Winter became the memory of her absence, spring the celebration of her return. Thus the cycle of seasons was born, not as accident of weather, but as divine memory, grief, and reunion written into the earth. Hades is often cast as villain in this tale. Yet notice, when Demeter demanded her daughter back entirely, it was Hades who offered balance. He did not rage, he did not refuse, he did not demand eternal possession. He structured 6 seeds, 6 months. The rhythm of agriculture, the certainty of return. He gave not chains, but a calendar. And Persephone herself is no mere captive in the older myths. She becomes Kor, maiden of spring above, and Persephone, dread queen below. On the throne beside Hades, she is not silent. She judges, she rules, she receives offerings. Together, they form a dyad, law and cycle, death and renewal, shadow and grain. The Greeks saw this not as tragedy alone, but as explanation. Why do fields sleep in winter? Because the queen sits below. Why does wheat erupt in spring? Because she rises. The myth taught that endings and beginnings are not opposites, but halves of the same turning. For Hades, this was the one great act of passion recorded in myth. To choose a queen, to claim her with gravity, and then to honor her role with equality. Where Zeus paraded mistresses and Poseidon scattered affairs across the coasts, Hades shared a throne. Persephone was not one among many. She was the one. In vase paintings, they sit together, serene. She holds the pomegranate, he the staff. Around them, symbols of fertility, torches, flowers, grain. The message is subtle but powerful. The underworld is not sterile. It is the soil in which life sleeps until time calls it back. Thus, Persephone's descent is not just an abduction story, but a cosmology. The world requires loss to know renewal. Seeds must vanish in darkness to rise again green. And Hades, often miscast as thief, becomes instead the steward of return, the partner in a cosmic rhythm that even gods obey. In silence, he claimed her. In law, he shared her. In their union, the Greeks learned to name the seasons not as accidents of weather, but as memories of a goddess who belongs to two worlds, and a god who rules one of them with order, not cruelty. Every great kingdom is tested not by its quiet days, but by the intrusions that come to its gates. The underworld was no exception. Though mortals feared its shadows, heroes and tricksters still tried their luck, seeking to bend death, to outwit law, to steal back what was already counted. And each time, Hades revealed not cruelty, but fairness. Stern, impartial, and often merciful within the bounds of order. Take the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus, the singer whose music could charm stones and soften rivers, lost his beloved bride to a serpent's bite. Grief-stricken, he descended to Hades, lyre in hand, his song filling the caverns with sorrow so pure even the Furies wept. Persephone, moved, spoke to her husband, and Hades, who seldom granted exceptions, did something extraordinary. He gave Orpheus a chance. Eurydice could follow him back on one condition. He must not look behind until both had crossed the boundary. It was mercy tempered with law. The condition was not cruel. It was necessary, for no soul could return without cost. Yet Orpheus faltered, glancing back in doubt. In that instant, Eurydice dissolved like mist. Hades had kept his word. Orpheus had broken the condition. Justice stood, sorrowful but unwavering. Then there is Sisyphus, the cunning king of Corinth. Twice he tricked death, chaining Thanatos himself, delaying the passage of souls. For a time, no one died. Armies clashed and no warriors fell, the natural balance suspended. But deception has a price. When Hades restored order, Sisyphus was sentenced not to flame or torture, but to futility, forever rolling a stone uphill, only for it to fall again. The punishment matched the crime. Deception answered with endless frustration. Symbol, not sadism. Consider Heracles, sent on his 12th labor to capture Cerberus. Most rulers would have seen this as an insult, sending a hero to steal the guardian of the gates. But Hades did not rage. He allowed it, with one condition. Heracles must subdue Cerberus with no weapons, only strength. It was a test of courage, not rebellion. Heracles succeeded, showing the balance between mortal bravery and divine law. Cerberus returned unharmed, and Hades' realm remained unbroken. Even the tale of Theseus and Pirate House carries the same theme. The two heroes dared to invade the underworld to claim Persephone herself as a bride. Many gods would have obliterated such arrogance in fury. Hades did not. He simply invited them to sit in his hall of forgetting. The chairs became bonds. Theseus eventually freed by Heracles, Pirate House forever bound. No thunder, no fire, just inevitability. The quiet weight of consequences catching up. In each of these stories, the pattern repeats. Hades does not lash out, does not torture for amusement, does not hunt mortals for sport. He listens, he considers, and he answers with measured fairness. When mercy is possible, he grants it, but always with conditions. When punishment is required, it is not destruction, but reflection, the crime mirrored back upon the criminal. To mortals, This was terrifying, not because he was cruel, but because he was incorruptible. Zeus could be flattered, Poseidon appeased. But Hades could not be swayed by song, sacrifice, or bribe. His law was absolute. And yet, that absoluteness also meant fairness. Every mortal, whether king or beggar, received the same treatment at his gates. No one was beneath his notice, and no one above it. In this way, the trials of the underworld reveal the essence of Hades' rule. He is not the god of fire or pain. He is the god of limits, of boundaries that cannot be tricked without consequence. And within those boundaries, he proves himself not a devil, but a judge. One who listens, weighs, and answers with silence that feels heavier than thunder. The Greeks did not imagine a paradise of eternal joy, nor a hell of eternal flame. They imagined Hades' realm as a mirror of the living world, stripped of vanity. Heroes came and failed, kings schemed and fell, lovers wept and returned alone. And through it all, the silent king remained the same. Fair, unyielding, balanced. The trials of the underworld are not cautionary tales about cruelty. They are reminders of law. Break it, and you face yourself forever. Respect it, and even in death, you are received with dignity. Beneath the granite weight of his rule, beneath the silence of gates and rivers, there were still moments when Hades revealed something softer, quieter, a tenderness not often told. His love for Persephone was constant, unshaken across seasons. But mythology hints at other stories too. Fragments where his heart brushed against mortals or nymphs and left behind strange memorials. There was Minthe, a nymph of the Cocytus River. Her beauty was whispered in meadows, her laughter carried on breezes. In some tellings, she drew Hades' attention, her presence a rare spark in his shadowed kingdom. Yet when Persephone learned of her, the queen's jealousy was swift. Minthe was crushed, transformed into the plant we still know. Mint. Fragrant, enduring, its leaves carry both freshness and sorrow. The lingering trace of an affection cut short. For every time mortals smelled its sharp sweetness, they remembered that even the god of silence once felt stirrings of desire. Then came Luce, daughter of Oceanus. Hades loved her too, but her life, like all mortal lives, was brief. When she died, he did not rage against the inevitability he himself embodied. Instead, he honored her memory. He transformed her into a white poplar tree, planted in the groves of the Elysian fields, where heroes walk in peace. Her branches stood pale against the shadows, a symbol that love, even when ended, could be rooted in eternity. These stories are not catalogs of conquest like those of Zeus or Poseidon. They are footnotes, whispers. Where his brothers left a storm of lovers and children, Hades left plants, trees, leaves, aromas. Quiet, unassuming memorials that lingered long after. His passion, rare and restrained, left no chaos behind, only symbols that mortals could touch, smell, and remember. Even in his great love for Persephone, affection is wrapped in ritual rather than display. When she rises to the surface each spring, he does not chase her with storms. When she descends each autumn, he does not lock her in chains. Their bond is solemn, cyclical, marked by pomegranate seeds and the rhythm of seasons. Hades' love is never loud. It is patient, enduring, carved into time itself. In this, Hades shows a humanity the other gods often lack. He knows longing, and he knows loss. He cannot overturn death, even for those he loves, but he can transform it into mint that perfumes the air, into poplars that shade the Elysian fields, into rituals that mark the turning of the year. Where other gods burned with appetite, Hades grieved, remembered, and wove memory into permanence. These whispers of affection reveal a truth. The god of the underworld was not devoid of feeling. He simply expressed it differently. Not in fire, but in root. Not in thunder, but in fragrance. Not in fleeting passion, but in memorials that outlast lifetimes. In the end, his tenderness was not a contradiction to his sternness. It was its companion. For what is restraint, if not the deepest form of care? What is silence, if not the space where love can endure without spectacle? Hades, ruler of the dead, proved through his rare affections that even in the kingdom of endings, beauty could take root and live forever. Every god bore symbols, but the ones tied to Hades were never chosen for spectacle. They were chosen for inevitability. The first and most enduring was his Helm of Invisibility, the gift from the Cyclopes that had made him the ghostly strategist in the Titanomachy. More than a weapon, it was a truth. Hades was unseen not because he was weak, but because he embodied what mortals cannot see until it is upon them. Death moves silently. Presence revealed too soon would be intrusion. Presence revealed too late would be cruelty. His helm taught that inevitability works best when unnoticed. Then came the bident, the two-pronged staff he held. Unlike Poseidon's trident, which churned seas and shattered cliffs, the bident was not built for drama. It marked jurisdiction, not domination. Two prongs, like two paths. Life and death, surface and underworld. It was a symbol of passage, not punishment. At his side always, Cerberus, the guardian hound. A symbol of boundaries, of vigilance. Each head watched a different path. The way in, the way out, the way between. Cerberus was not bred to attack the dead, but to remind mortals that once the threshold was crossed, there was no return without divine law. Perhaps most telling was the key, a simple emblem often placed in his hand by vase painters. Hades did not need bolts or bars. His realm was locked by the very fabric of existence. Yet the key reminded mortals that laws are doors, and doors need guardians. To hold the key was to embody the role of gatekeeper, the one who allowed no trick of rhetoric, no charm of flattery, to pass without order. And then came the titles. Hades, the unseen one. Pluton, the wealthy. Here the imagery shifted from shadow to abundance. To the Greeks, wealth came from below. Metals, jewels, harvest roots, seed buried in soil. Without the dark, there is no growth. In this sense, Hades was paradoxically a god of fertility. Farmers prayed to Pluton for soil to yield. His shadow was the womb of the earth. But perhaps the most profound symbol of Hades was not an object, not an animal, not even a title. It was inevitability itself. Unlike Zeus, who hurled thunder in anger, or Poseidon, who shook the sea with pride, Hades needed no display. He ruled the one domain no mortal could deny. Every culture fears death. The Greeks gave it dignity by clothing it in a god's face. That face was Hades. This explains why his image was often veiled in euphemism. To name him directly was to draw attention from the shadow. Instead, mortals used gentler phrases: the hospitable one, the good counselor, the receiver of many. These names did not erase fear, but they softened it into respect. They reflected an ancient truth. Death is not an enemy to be fought forever, but a host who eventually welcomes every guest. Thus his symbols carried double meanings. The bident marked a ruler, but also a path. Cerberus looked fearsome, but was only a guard dog obeying law. The key reminded mortals of locks, but also of trust. That doors exist not only to close, but to keep the world in balance. And Pluton's cornucopia reminded all that the same soil which holds the dead also feeds the living. In the end, Hades' symbols tell us more than his stories. They show the architecture of his power: quiet, inevitable, impartial. Fire is spectacular, but it burns out. Thunder shakes the sky, but silence always returns. What never returns is life once it has crossed his threshold. That finality was his truest emblem, his quiet crown. No horns, no pitchfork, no cavern of torment. Only helm, staff, key, hound. Only names spoken sideways, offerings given at night, and a throne that reminded mortals that all roads end in shadow. And in that shadow, order waits. Not as cruelty, not as comfort, but as the structure of what cannot be escaped. Centuries pass like shadows lengthening across stone, and with them, stories bend. The Hades of Homer and Hesiod, quiet, stern, impartial, began to blur. In Roman mouths, he became Dispater, the rich father. In mystery cults, he was Pluton, dispenser of hidden abundance. But as the world shifted toward new faiths, his image was rewritten, piece by piece, until almost nothing of the old remained. It began subtly. Roman poets, eager to dramatize, painted him with darker strokes. The Latin imagination loved contrast. Gods of dawn, gods of dusk, gods of terror. Hades, renamed Pluto, became more shadowed, more fearsome, though still not devilish. Yet with each retelling, distance grew from the Greek restraint. Then came the early Christians, inheriting a world thick with gods they called false. To teach salvation, they needed contrast. Heaven required a hell. The underworld of Hades became convenient clay. His name, once whispered as a neutral inevitability, was twisted into synonym for torment. Hades in Scripture became not a god, but a place, a pit, a realm of punishment. Slowly, the sovereign was erased, replaced by an empty space called hell. Medieval imagination poured fire into that space. Woodcuts showed horned figures with pitchforks chasing sinners into flames. Dante's Inferno descended through rings of grotesque punishments. Frauds, traitors, heretics, all screaming while Satan himself lay frozen at the bottom. Hades' calm throne was forgotten. In his place stood a caricature, a rebel, a torturer, an enemy of God. Art followed. Church walls filled with demons shrieking, dragging souls into cauldrons. Sculptures carved gaping maws of hell, swallowing the damned. The old magistrate in robes was nowhere to be seen. Children grew up knowing not Hades, but hell. Not Pluton, but the devil. The distortion continued into modernity. Disney painted him as a sarcastic trickster with blue flames for hair. Video games cast him as a boss to be defeated. Comics turned him into schemers with skeletal faces or flame-lit crowns. Everywhere, the same misstep repeated. Hades as villain, as Satan, as chaos incarnate. But peel back the centuries, and the difference glares. The Greek Hades was no rebel. He never defied Zeus. He never sought to topple Olympus. He was not a torturer. He delegated punishment to judges and furies, who worked by law, not whim. He was not horned, not winged, not aflame. He was robed, seated, measured. This twisting reveals more about cultures than about the god himself. Each era reshaped him to fit its fears. Romans needed a darker Pluto to balance Jupiter. Christians needed a hell to contrast heaven. Medieval Europe needed demons to terrify peasants into obedience. Modern entertainment needed villains to sell tickets. And so the silent king was dragged through centuries of costume changes until his truth was nearly erased. Yet in the cracks of history, the old figure endures. In the shards of black figure pottery, Hades still sits dignified. In the Eleusinian mysteries, he is still Pluton, partner of Demeter and Persephone, linked to cycles of fertility as much as endings. and whispered Greek prayers, his name is still softened out of respect, not hatred. The tragedy is not his vilification, it is his flattening. From a complex god of inevitability, balance, and restraint, he became a one-note villain. From ruler of boundaries, he became caricature of rebellion. From host of the dead, he became tormentor of souls. A misdrawn shadow replaced the real. But remembering him correctly is not mere pedantry. It changes the lens. To see Hades as Satan is to fear him as enemy. To see him as he was is to understand him as necessity. Not evil, not good, but balance. The Greeks knew this. Life and death, sowing and harvest, love and loss, all require each other. Hades was not chaos. He was the structure that keeps chaos from breaking loose. Time twisted his name. Culture rewrote his throne. But beneath those distortions, the original truth waits, quiet as ever, steady as stone. Hades, king not of torment, but of order and shadow. Every myth, when peeled back, reveals not only gods, but structures, ways the ancients explained why the world holds together. Zeus thundered so mortals would know the sky had a voice. Poseidon quaked the ground so sailors and farmers would remember humility before the sea. And Hades, he did not announce himself with storms or noise. His lesson was subtler, but just as necessary. Without endings, there can be no balance. Imagine a cosmos without him. Zeus and Poseidon share the world above, the air restless, the waters unstable. Mortals are born, but none die. Heroes fall in battle yet rise again. Cities grow until they choke themselves. Generations pile on generations with no cycle of release. Order collapses beneath its own weight. Without Hades, life itself becomes a prison. The Greeks understood this instinctively. They feared his silence, yes, but they also relied upon it. He was the counterweight to Zeus's sky and Poseidon's sea. Together, the three brothers made a tripod on which the world could stand. Remove one leg, and the whole cosmos tilts. This balance extended beyond gods into human life. Farmers buried seed in earth, the unseen Hades realm. Only through that burial would green stalks rise. Families laid their dead into soil, not as waste, but as continuation. Grain for the fields, memory for the living. The underworld was not void, but womb. A cycle, not a wall. The Eleusinian mysteries hinted at this truth. In their secret rites, initiates learned that death was not annihilation, but transformation. Hades and Persephone were not devils, but teachers. Guides who revealed that endings are gateways. The harvest dies so the seed can return. Persephone descends so she may rise. Mortals too vanish into shadow, not as erasure, but as part of a rhythm larger than themselves. Balance also marked his character among the gods. Zeus was lightning, instant, decisive, destructive. Poseidon was the tide, restless, surging, impossible to contain. Hades was stone, still enduring, incorruptible. Lightning scorches, tides recede, but stone remains. His steadiness made him the most reliable of the brothers. No wild seductions, no boasts carved across the sky, no sudden storms. Only constancy, the balance of silence against noise. In this light, even his sternness becomes compassion. To mortals who feared death, he offered equality. Kings and beggars, heroes and cowards. None escaped his reach, but none were denied it either. The poor could look at tyrants and know that in the end, both would kneel to the same king. In a world fractured by inequality, Hades alone guaranteed balance. Later ages missed this truth when they twisted him into villain. A world without his balance imagines death only as terror, never as necessity. But the Greeks did not see him that way. To them, he was grim but indispensable, feared but respected. The soil they plowed, the seed they planted, the tombs they built, all testified to the same lesson. Without Hades, the cosmos loses symmetry. And so he stands, forgotten by many, misunderstood by most, yet still essential. Where Zeus dazzles and Poseidon roars, Hades waits, silent, patient, constant. His throne does not glitter, but it holds the world steady. The forgotten balance is this: he is not good, not evil, but necessary. And necessity, when given a face, is more powerful than thunder. Silence is his crown. Not silence of absence, but silence of completion. The hush after a song ends, the stillness after waves have spent themselves on shore. That is the realm of Hades. When mortals imagined the underworld, they did not see fire or devils. They saw halls of stone, rivers that murmured softly, judges seated at gates, a king who did not rise in fury but sat, listening. He is not adversary. He is not savior. He is not temptation nor torment. He is simply the keeper of the inevitable. His throne stands where all paths converge, not because he hunts souls, but because time escorts them to his gate. In him the Greeks saw what they themselves could never avoid: endings. And in his quiet governance, they found a strange reassurance that even in death, there was order, not chaos. Picture him, robed in black and red, seated with Persephone at his side, Cerberus at his feet, Charon waiting at the river, the Furies in the shadows. Each presence marks a boundary, each figure part of the structure that keeps the world from unraveling. This is not hell. It is a courtroom where law whispers instead of shouts. It is not cruelty. It is necessity. The myths that tell of him all circle the same truth. Orpheus is given a chance, fair though lost. Sisyphus is punished not with fire, but futility, a mirror of his crime. Heracles is permitted, if strong enough, to lead Cerberus up and back again. Theseus and Heracles are ensnared not by whips, but by their own hubris. Again and again, Hades proves himself not devil, but judge, not sadist, but steward of boundaries. And this is why the distortion matters. When later ages painted him as Satan, they stripped the cosmos of its balance. They turned the necessary into the monstrous, and in doing so, they blinded themselves to the truth. Without Hades, nothing holds. Without endings, beginnings have no meaning. Without law, life unravels into chaos. The Greeks knew. They did not build him countless temples, but they honored him with solemn offerings. They avoided his name, not because they hated him, but because they respected the gravity it carried. They called him Pluton, the wealthy, acknowledging that beneath the soil lies the seed, the gem, the memory. His wealth was not in torment, but in the deep reserves that sustain the living. And so, when the story of Hades is retold truthfully, it becomes something far softer, far more profound. He is not the enemy. He is the end, yes, but also the measure that makes beginnings precious. He is the reminder that every feast will fade, every crown will tarnish, every storm will calm. And yet, in the stillness afterward, there is not nothing but order. The eternal judge does not roar, does not boast. He waits. And when all roads finally slope toward his gate, he receives each traveler the same way, quietly, fairly, without spectacle. Now the story closes, and the pace slows, as all stories must. Imagine the underworld not as terror, but as calm. A river glides under a dim sky, its current steady, its ferry waiting. Torches flicker against stone corridors where voices lower to whispers. Persephone sits on her throne, serene, half smiling, a queen who knows both loss and return. Hades beside her, silent, watchful, not cruel, not tender, but constant. The myths fade into dusk. The caricatures of horns and flames dissolve like smoke. What remains is something steadier, the quiet figure who keeps balance, who holds the final key. And you, listening, are reminded of a truth older than temples, older than thunder, older even than poetry. That endings are not enemies, but the shadows that make beginnings glow brighter. That silence is not void, but completion. That Hades, long misunderstood, is not devil, not monster, but necessity itself. So let the words fall soft now. The story's finished. The king remains, seated in the stillness that follows all things, a reminder not of fear, but of order. And in that order, even shadows have their place. The tale lingers a moment more, and then, like all journeys, it too finds its ending.